elements of a moral panic here. One of the key elements here is the interaction of government agencies, or I should say official agencies, that get involved in this. And an example here is like law enforcement. So in the case of like drug abusers, you get law enforcement. You got to be tough on crime, and that usually involves, you know, having really draconian drug penalties, for example. In the case of some types of moral panics, child welfare agencies get involved. One of the big moral panics of our time was, I think it was back in the, was it the 80s when the McMartin preschool, the sex abuse scandal came out?
I don't know about that.
Yeah, there was a scandal that involved a preschool in California. I believe this was back in the 80s. The McMartin preschool, where a bunch of kids came forward and accused these teachers of having sexually molested them. And this mushroomed into this satanic ritual abuse claim. And so this thing spread like a panic all over the place. And there were people who were accused of ritually abusing children, murdering infants, things like that. And of course, when police investigated this, there was never any physical evidence that this was actually going on. But people absolutely believed it. And because of the interview techniques that some of the social workers and law enforcement agencies use against these children, the children ended up telling these very fanciful tales that involved, you know, some really horrific instances of abuse. Unfortunately, for the people involved, a lot of innocent people were sent to prison. And in fact, there's still a guy in prison in California who was convicted of molesting his son, even though his son has long since recanted and said that never happened. I just believed that if I didn't say what they wanted me to say, that I wouldn't ever be allowed to go home.
That's terrible.
Yeah, so he's still sitting in prison because in every other case, there were several other people convicted in that particular case, but there was always some kind of flaw in the prosecution's case, and they were able to uncover it. For example, one of the girls who said that her father molested her, they came up with a physical examination where the nurse that examined her said there's no evidence of sexual abuse. And so that was one of the things that was used to help free her father.
Yeah, I've also heard a lot about so-called repressed memories.
Yeah.
Does that tie into this?
Yeah, that's connected because
yeah, there are a lot of cases. You can read about this on the Skeptics Dictionary. They have a pretty good article about it there, where there are a lot of cases where people, under basically what would be known as leading the witness in court, psychiatrists would give people leading questions, which would lead people to think, oh yeah, I do remember something like my father coming in when I was asleep at night, and then so having a lot of cases where they just don't, they claim not to have remembered until it was drawn out of them that there was molestation by people who are ultimately innocent. Yes.
Yeah, and in the case of young children, they're particularly suggestible.
Right.
So you have to be careful how, and of course now, as a result of all this, we have interview techniques that are pretty good at interviewing children, but not foolproof. And then, of course, so child welfare agencies sometimes get involved in this. Even other agencies like professional associations can sometimes get involved in this. In some cases, they're not actually professional associations, but they are like pseudo-professional organizations. And one of the favored tactics of some of these people involved in anti-gay research and stuff like that is that they set up some kind of institute for researching this problem. And then, of course, they come up with their own view of what is essentially an ideological divide. They put this out there as legitimate social research, and of course it's not. One of the major offenders in this is a guy named Paul Cameron. I want to talk a little bit about him because he's actually where a lot of this so-called data on how gay people in particular are not appropriate as parents or are foster parents. That factored heavily into the Arkansas adoption bill. He's actually the originator of a lot of this research. And it was methodologically unsound, and I'll talk to him in a minute, but I want to get through the elements of the moral panic. The last thing that is involved here is politicians and legislators. You know, politicians rise to the occasion and say, oh, well, we'll pass a law. And the legislators, of course, you know, hop on the bandwagon and fight over who's going to write the law and who's going to vote for it and stuff like that. So, you know, what's a good moral panic without a politician in the mix? So
it's good political theater.
Absolutely. And that's one of the best ways to describe it, is political theater. So those are the elements of a moral panic. Media, public perceptions, the public perceives this brewing threat. You've got government agencies, politicians and legislators, and of course the moral entrepreneurs who are sort of directing things behind the scenes.
Right. It seems to me a good person to level a moral panic against is somebody that people already don't trust, but also don't actually have very much power themselves. Because if they have a certain level of actual power, then they could fight it and be a dangerous opponent. But if you go after, what comes to mind is Dungeons and Dragons players,
right?
You know, which was also a big thing during the 80s, right? I mean, there's no good organized Dungeons and Dragons coalition there. So I mean, you know, who's going to hear the other side if you've got people yelling about D&D destroying our children? Or,
you know, rock music. For a while among religious circles, there was this whole idea about backmasked rock music, that if you play your music backwards, you know, that you're going to hear satanic messages.
Did you know that Weird Al actually did that?
Yeah.
You did, okay.
Yeah, well, and when...
I like to actually mention on the song Nature Trail to Hell, Weird Al plays this scene, plays this clip that's obviously backward stuff, and it's easy to turn records around now because of digital technology, and backwards it says, "Satan eats cheese whiz."
Well, and of course Santa is an anagram for Satan.
Oh, of course, yeah. I doubt that was as intentional.
Yeah.
We'll take you to hell.